Why was the Roman military such a force to be reckoned with? This is part 2 of a short series on the Roman military. How did the Roman military structure work? What sort of men joined the Roman military? And what kinds of roles did they play? What did they actually do with their time? They served for 20 to 25 years. Were they just sitting around in garrisons, or were they fighting all of the time? As it turns out, Roman soldiers had a lot of different things to do, and they needed a variety of skills. You may think also that the Romans were eager to have just about anybody serve in the military, but as we'll see today, that wasn't the case either. There were some serious restrictions on who could become a soldier. Part of this is because the Roman military offered some credible opportunities for advancement in Roman society, and for non-citizens, it offered them the opportunity to become Roman. And so we are going to continue delving into the fascinating world of the Roman military on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 45, The Roman Military, Part 2. Before we get started on today's episode, a few small programming notes. First of all, there may not be an episode next week. I have a lot of speaking engagements right now and some travel, so I'm going to try to put one out, but if I don't, you'll know why. Now, if you want to catch any of those talks, I'll mention a few of them right now. If you live in Israel, I'll be giving the keynote address at the Economic History Association annual meeting there at Ben Gurion University. That's at the very end of May. The week after that, I will be giving a talk at the York Festival of Ideas in England. That is a virtual talk, so anybody in the world can attend that. Just search for my name and York Festival Ideas. I think they've titled the talk the same title as my new book, Pax Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World. So you can catch that. And then in the second week of June, I'll be giving a talk for Indiana University alumni at Indiana University, also on the Antonine Plague. So if you are alumni of Indiana University and you're going to be in Bloomington, Indiana for their mini university, you're welcome to sign up for my talk. I'd love to get a chance to meet folks that listen to this podcast and also are affiliated with my own university. And I think that's all that we need to say ahead of the podcast. Let's get on with today's episode. On the last episode, I talked at length about the militaristic culture of the Pax Romana. We talked about how large the army was and how much it tended to cost. Today, I want to spend some time on the structure of the military, as well as what daily life was like for Roman soldiers. Now, it goes without saying, the emperor was the head of the military and nobody else. He did not share this privilege with anyone. Very quickly, when the empire begins, all other symbolic leadership is squeezed out. Under the Roman Republic, many men had cults of personality and the personal loyalty of their legions. They often exploited that, using what were ostensibly Rome's legions for their own personal pet projects and wars of adventure, and in some cases, wars of rebellion against the Roman state. The emperors want none of that, not even a whiff. And so very quickly, emperors monopolize leadership. They do not allow oaths to other imperial family members, to other men, oaths to generals, or anything like that. Now, there are some exceptions to that. Caligula, for example, made his soldiers swear to his sisters. But for the most part, the emperor was the functional and symbolic head of the military during the Pax Romana. Now, he didn't actually run the military. In fact, rarely did emperors actually command soldiers in the field. So what they did was appoint legates over each legion. These men were usually elites. They were senators or equestrians, and you know a little more about who those sorts of men were from episode 42. Emperors tended to put senators in charge of soldiers that were not likely to rebel. And by contrast, equestrian legates were usually considered more trustworthy by emperors. They were given the more important commands. Each of these legates, in turn, had junior officers. They were usually younger men in their 20s, the sons of senators and equestrians who needed to learn the ropes of command. They did not start at the grunt level or the legionary level of the military. They got a shortcut into what is effectively on-the-job officer training or officer apprenticeships as military tribunes. Occasionally, younger elites would find themselves serving in one of the lower officer positions. So there was, for example, a primus pilus. This is the first spear. This was either, like I said, a young elite or a veteran low-class soldier who had risen up through the ranks, and this was about the highest he could expect to go. The primus pilus was the main tactical advisor to a legate. He needed to be literate in order to implement the commands of his superior, and his duties could be just about anything that the legate really didn't want to do or didn't feel like he needed to do himself. But the primus pilus was in on all of the officer meetings, but at the same time, he constantly was around the rank and file soldiers. He would have known them and they would have known him. He was a kind of intermediary between the low-class, illiterate soldiers and the upper-class, elite officers. Serving as a primus pilus was a great opportunity for a man who had risen through the ranks, because once he retired in that position, and again, he usually did not go any higher, he would be given the rank of equestrian after his retirement. Now, that didn't always benefit him, but it could benefit his sons and his grandsons. And so we see already that built into the structure of the military, there were opportunities here to move up the Roman social hierarchy that we just don't see anywhere else. And this is another reason why military service was something which people gladly volunteered to do. The lowest level of officer was then the centurion. And you've probably heard this term. You likely associate it with the idea of a century, or 100 years, or 100 men. Roman centuries were originally that number. In practice, men died or extra men were recruited, and so the centuries were not always 100 men. In fact, usually they were between 80, or they could get as high as 120 men, or maybe even a little higher. And the centurion was the officer directly in charge of these men. He gave them orders in combat based on orders that he had received. He was really in charge of the practical functioning of this unit of men in battle. He himself also had a kind of deputy, a man that was called an optio, who shadowed him. And then from there, you just have the rank and file soldiers. In the Roman military system, there was not something like the code of military justice, which made it clear which orders were lawful and which ones weren't. For the Romans, officers had absolute authority over soldiers. They had what is called imperium, the right to command and expect immediate and automatic compliance. Soldiers who did not obey the orders of their officers could expect execution, or if they got off a little easier than that, flogging or hard labor. Joining the military for the rank and file soldiers was usually a lifelong career. For elites, this was not always the case. It was often something to do before and then between political offices. They came into the military for a year or two, commanded some soldiers, moved them around, supervised them in a garrison or whatever, and then they went back to Rome and ran for office. So elites had it pretty good. The rest of the soldiers were in a large mass of men. Each legion, for example, was about 5,000 men, could go as high as maybe 7,000 men, depending on recruitment and losses. The legion also was then supported by cavalry, supply people, standard bearers, and so on. As I said in the last episode, men happily volunteered to serve. There could be conscriptions in the case of emergency wars or conflicts, but even then it seems that for the most part, there was no difficulty in terms of recruiting soldiers. The pay was stable, status was there, a retirement bonus, opportunities to advance. To join the legions, one had to be a Roman citizen. There were times when the need for legionaries was high enough that emperors or commanders granted citizenship upon joining the legions. Not everybody, however, was allowed in the military. You could not be a slave or a former slave. We know from the letters of Pliny and Trajan that slaves who were found in the Roman legions were punished severely. Listen to this letter, for example, from Pliny to the Emperor Trajan, and then I'll share with you Trajan's reply. Here's Pliny, quote, Sempronius Kilianus, an outstanding young man, sent 2 slaves to me who were discovered among the recruits. I've deferred punishing them so as to consult you, Trajan, the founder and strengthener of military discipline, on the proper penalty. For I'm especially in doubt about this, because though they've already taken the oath, they have not yet been assigned to the ranks. I beg you, therefore, my lord, to write me what course I should follow, especially since precedent is involved. So that's Pliny's letter to Trajan. It's interesting that Pliny is unsure of exactly what to do because the slaves are in a limbo. They've taken an oath, but have not been assigned to ranks, and he realizes that Trajan's decision on this is going to set a precedent. We also see in this letter Trajan's clear designation as head of the military when Pliny calls him the founder and strengthener of military discipline. All right, here is Trajan's reply. Quote, Sempronius Kilianus acted in accordance with my instructions in sending to you these persons, concerning whom an investigation will be necessary to determine whether they seem deserving of capital punishment. It's material whether they enlisted voluntarily or were levied or offered as proxies. If they were levied, the examination was at fault. If they were offered as proxies, the guilt lies with those who offered them. But if they themselves, although they were fully aware of their status, enlisted, then they are the ones to be punished. It does not make much difference that they have not yet been assigned to the ranks, for on the very day on which they were approved, they were required to give a true statement of their birth status. Trajan here shows his typical justice. He could just punish the slaves and be done with it, but he does want to ensure military discipline. He wants to know if these slaves deceived their recruiters or if the recruiters were lax in their job. Now, Trajan also mentions proxies. What may be going on here is some kind of conscription. And there were men who did not wish to be conscripted in the army, and so they offered these slaves in their place, that is, as proxies. And Trajan wants to know if they did that knowing that they were slaves, if these slaves happened to be proxies. But once you were in, you were in. You had a term-limited contract, usually between 20 and 25 years. I say between 20 and 25 years because military discharge did not happen on an individual level. It was usually done in groups. So some soldiers had to wait longer because they had gotten into their group earlier than those that had gotten into it a few years later, but then the whole group would be discharged at the same time. So some ended up serving a year or 2 or 3 or whatever longer than their colleagues in that unit. Soldiers obviously had to be physically capable of battle, and they had to be at least 18 years old. The duties of soldiers once they got into the military could be just about anything. Again, whatever an officer told them to do, they had to do. A later Roman source, Vegetius, speaks about military service in the Roman Empire. He mentions soldiers marching together, being able to keep tempo and time as they walked with their units. He talks about soldiers being capable of leaping and jumping over obstacles, having the ability to swim, the physical strength to carry burdens of up to 60 pounds while on the march. They should be able to use any standard weapon that they may either be carrying with them or from an enemy. They should have boats and be able to operate them. And they should have some training in siege equipment. Obviously, they had to fight in battles. That goes without saying. But quite a lot of their work was construction and engineering and other forms of manual labor. Soldiers constructed the roads. Soldiers built buildings and even things like aqueducts and bathhouses. Soldiers were employed to guard resources like mines or river crossings. They were used to supervise tax collection. It was not a strange thing to see soldiers at a port or a city gateway collecting tariffs. They also engaged in some policing activities, walking around settlements and cities, keeping order. Sometimes they would be sent out into the wilderness to find bandits. They might patrol roadways or rivers in order to prevent thefts and smuggling. In some cases, a soldier could be appealed to resolve some kind of local dispute. Over time in the Pax Romana, it became normal for sons of soldiers to carry on in the career of their fathers. And this is true whether these sons were legitimate or illegitimate, because as I mentioned last time, soldiers were, throughout the entirety of the Pax Romana, prevented from legal marriage and having legal, legitimate children. Again, soldiers had children. It's just that their children's birthplace would be listed as the camp, and their nationhood would not be in a particular place because they were not legitimate. They were just kind of camp orphans, basically. Their nation was the army itself. Now, once the soldier finished his service and retired, he could choose to legitimize his own children and his wife if he had one. And at this point, everything would be made legal. For non-citizens, by the way, and as we saw last time, they make up half of the military, our non-citizen auxiliary units. Their situation is similar in some ways. In other ways, it is different. Many of the same duties, for example, were part of the daily routine of auxiliaries as they were for legionaries. There was very little different. They also had commanders, and they had a kind of unity about them as well. In many cases, auxiliaries were recruited in groups, all from one location, and they were kept together. So while they needed to use Latin as the official language of the military, they could all communicate in their own native language. They obviously joined the military sometimes because they had to, as part of a treaty or some kind of conscription agreement. But in other times, they did so voluntarily because the bonus that they received at the end of their service was usually citizenship, which obviously they could then pass on to their children. So now you know how large the military was, how much soldiers were paid, and how they were paid. And today, you know a little bit more now about who soldiers were and the kinds of things that they did. But there's still one question that I would like to answer. How disciplined were these soldiers really? You probably have an image of legions marching in step, maybe even forming a testudo. And if you don't know what that is, you're in for a treat for the next episode. I'll explain what that is. But many people imagine Roman soldiers in a particular way. How much integrity did these men have? Do we have sources that give us a sense of how trustworthy soldiers were? Did they abuse their power? What kind of men were they? Now, we obviously can't look into the heart of each and every Roman soldier, but we have some fascinating sources that explain what soldiers thought of themselves, but also what the inhabitants and citizens of the Roman Empire thought about their own military. And we'll talk about those sources on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.